Good morning, everybody. This is Simon from the team at Food Power based at Sustain. Before I go any further, could you just type in the attendee chat box just where you're from? It's just a way of us understanding where everyone's from, but also making sure that the sound is working for you. So the attendee chat should be visible to you on the left-hand side. Great, we've got those coming through now. We've got Murray in Scotland, York, Exeter, Guildford, Croydon, Preston, Pisa, Australia, Colchester, Enfield in London, Brighton and Hove, the Independent Food Aid Network, Manchester. I could see that a few people were having it was indicating that your internet might not be as strong. So I think on Wi-Fi, the signal can sometimes be a bit difficult. So there's obviously nothing I can do about that at that end, this end, but that may be why you have any connection difficulties. Bradford, great. Really great to have you all on the webinar today, which is about measuring and mapping food poverty and the local response. And just for those who aren't aware of Food Power, especially our international attendees, Food Power is a 4-year programme led by Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, and Church Action on Poverty, and we're funded by the Big Lottery Fund. And we're bringing together a network of food poverty alliances or networks or other consortiums who are tackling food poverty and its root causes in their local areas in the UK. And our sort of vision for Food Power is that by the end of the programme, there'll be a more coordinated, long-term, sustainable and tailored approach to tackling food poverty in the UK. Obviously, as part of that, recognising the great work that's already happening, but trying to make sure that's shared as much as possible between different areas around the UK. And crucial to that is peer-to-peer learning and support. We certainly don't have all the answers, essentially. And a core part of the work which Church Action on Poverty are leading on is making sure that those with experience of food poverty have a stronger voice in alliances and networks tackling food poverty and its root causes. So ensuring those people's voices are heard at a more strategic level. And I think this measuring and mapping work is really relevant to our ambitions and the role of the network. We can see that measuring and mapping has been used to assess what the immediate response is in local areas, but also how maps and measurement can be used to shape and inform a longer term response with the ultimate aim of reducing food poverty in areas. So the way we work these webinars is for presenters to present their findings and then for people to ask your questions in the attendee chat as we go along, and we'll come to that at the end. It's a little bit hard to answer questions as we go along, but I will be keeping a note of what people are asking and make sure we read those questions out, and we'll come to that at the end. If possible, we'd ask you to use the attendee chat only rather than the question mark that you have at the top of your screens, though that's a way of asking us presenters questions. So it means that no one else can see it. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the website later as well. So I'll send that round via the newsletter next week, but it should be available on the website later today. And in terms of today's agenda, I'm going to be giving an overview of some of the sort of research I've done looking at what's been done in some areas around measuring and mapping activities. Wendy Eads from Feeding Coventry is going to talk about their 10 facts about food and poverty in Coventry and their food charter. And Chris Bagley from Greater Manchester Poverty Action is going to talk about the Greater Manchester Poverty Action Food Providers Map. And then, as I said, we'll have a Q&A after that. And I think the key thing for the things that we're all going to be talking about is that there are examples of what local areas have done. The aim is that you, as other areas, may pick up on people's experiences, learn from their experiences and perhaps things that haven't gone so well or haven't quite done what people intended, but also inspire you that around what might be possible to achieve in your area, and provide some context for your own work. So as I said, I've been pulling together some research around what is happening around the country, what are the examples that we think other areas might like to know about in particular in terms of any work they might like to do around measuring food poverty in their areas, or mapping what the local response is. So we will be publishing a briefing in March, but one aim of this webinar was to get a sense of the usefulness of what we cover today and how relevant that is to you. So that would also be great to get some feedback on during the questioning session. And a number of people have already fed in to that document, so I'm very grateful for that. And this work does also link to a wider evaluation toolkit that our evaluation partners at Cardiff University will also be producing later this year. So as I'm sure many of you will know, there is no UK-wide government-led measurement of household food insecurity or food poverty in the UK. Entangi UK, Food Foundation and others have also been campaigning with us at Sustain to ensure that there is a government measure of household food insecurity, and there is a bill in Parliament at the moment to secure that. There are two measures that we particularly champion to the UK government and other UK administrations. One is the USDA Food Security Survey module, which importantly for us includes an assessment of child food insecurity. And the other model is the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, which the United Nations use, which uses those 8 questions there to assess household food insecurity. And really importantly, these are the questions that the Scottish Government is starting to use in its survey of people in Scotland, starting with 3 questions this year. So I think both of these surveys and scales provide exemplar questions that local areas can still use. I think obviously the robustness will depend on the methodology used in terms of the survey size and representative nature of the cohort. So I think a lot of local areas have had to focus on looking at indicator data. And I think we have to be clear that a lot of the data that we will use at Sustain, Food Poverty, Food Power and in local areas is indicator data. It's not, in the absence of a proper government measure of household food insecurity, we're looking at data sources that can help us get a good picture of what the situation is locally. And Sustain produced a guide on developing food poverty action plans, which includes some suggestions for data sources for indicators that you might want to use locally. So those are on page 3 of that guide, which is available on the Sustain website. And one example of data is data sets the data sets used by Diana Smith, Claire Thompson and others in their recent work looking at the risk of household food insecurity in England. They combine data of household type in terms of deprivation from the census and some benefit claims data from the Department of Work and Pensions, but importantly not all benefits. So they've picked certain data sets to try and develop their methodology to. And I think what's interesting about this work is particularly interesting is that they also mapped their findings in terms of risk of food poverty against locations of trust or trust food banks. So not all food banks and certainly not all emergency food aid providers, but their research found that they couldn't find a statistical relationship between the number of food banks in the area and their measurement of risk of household food insecurity. So indicating that need and provision weren't necessarily matched up, which I think is an interesting finding in itself. Another example of indicator data is that provided by Public Health Department. So this is Public Health England providing some useful indicator data per local authority area on indicators of child poverty in particular. And I think the challenge for us as Food Power, as Sustain, and also local areas is how we present quite complex data, also proxy data that may not indicate immediately food poverty or household food insecurity itself. So this is one example from the London Borough of Greenwich and their food poverty review, where they used some quite striking infographics to communicate the indicator data that it has. So as with some of our slides today, they're not all as readable but via the slide format, but they are all available online and will be linked to via the briefing we're preparing. So the first one shows that 3 in 10 of eligible families are missing out on Healthy Start vouchers for fruit and veg. The second one with the unhappy faces shows that 2 in 10 children in Greenwich who should be accessing free school meals are not getting them. And the bottom one again is 3 in 10 children in Greenwich living in households in income deprivation. And I think it's important to say that Greenwich did a very substantial food poverty need assessment recently, sort of over 100 pages long, but they also recognised that they needed to produce this much shorter guide that is helpful in communicating what they found. In terms of food access, the FEAT, Food Environmental Assessment Tool, again, it does cover England only, but the different shades of red on the options that I picked when I was looking at the tool show the amount of food outlets that are available in each ward within Newcastle and its surrounding area in this case. So that's cafes, convenience stores, restaurants, specialty outlets, supermarkets and takeaways, and they can all be unticked. I think this gives some useful data in terms of prevalence of outlets within areas. I think there's probably more detailed work that there needs to go alongside it to really dig down into specific streets, etc., because we know that it is the very close proximity of, say, healthy fresh fruit and veg that is really important. And there are other examples in Sandwell in the Birmingham area where they've mapped the availability of healthy food. And again, in Greenwich, their full report looks at proximity of takeaways to schools, the proximity of food premises and markets, and also where retailers who accept the Healthy Start vouchers are living. And one other tool which I think is can be really powerful, and I think really bring home the points that we're often trying to make to decision makers and others, is using a shopping basket tool to assess both the availability and affordability of a regular shopping basket in people's local areas. So this shopping list, which I hope is legible, is from Tower Hamlets, where they looked at 4 different types of shopping basket given the very diverse communities in the borough. So I think that's a really helpful example in terms of thinking about local needs. It will obviously vary across different communities, different areas, but I think this is a great example. There are also examples again in Greenwich where they just used a shopping basket of 22 items in 35 shops in some of the more deprived areas of the borough and found massive differences in terms of availability and affordability of that shopping basket. And I know in Preston as well, in Deepdale and Ingle areas of Preston, they've compared shopping basket availability for both white British and South Asian families. And I think, as I say, talking to perhaps decision makers about what local people can buy in their local shops through this kind of shopping basket evidence can be really powerful. Then moving on to mapping provision, a lot of work has been going on nationally and locally to try and get a sense of the extent of emergency food aid, as well as community-based food projects and other kinds of projects addressing food poverty in the wider food system in local areas. So this is an example of the Independent Food Aid's map of independent food banks and other emergency food aid providers across the UK. From this sort of very zoomed out position, it's making very clear the high numbers of those independent food aid organisations. So really complementing the Trussell Trust map of its own food banks and really showing the extent of emergency food aid in the UK now. This is another example from Pilton in Edinburgh, as I understand it, an area that has a higher level of deprivation in the city. It's a map pulling together different food projects within the local area. It's got some very interesting functionality in that you can filter different projects using those the boxes in green at the top, and then actually print off a list of those which you've filtered into your search. So making, I think, that very usable for individuals or those referring individuals to specific projects. I think overall, when I've been looking at different kinds of maps of provision, the general findings are that people email in to a coordinator to amend the map. In some cases, there are databases that people can edit online and update the map automatically. I think there are sort of different levels of capacity that's taken up, and I think Chris is going to come on to that a bit in her presentation. The majority of maps that I'm aware of use Google Maps, but this one actually use a Grapply Django content management system and interface. I'm not a techie person, so I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I think it's obviously a different way of using the map functionality, developing some map functionality. And then in Lambeth, this is another example of a map where people can go in and edit the details for their project. And the point I would sort of emphasize from Lambeth is that they include local help, advice, and other kinds of support groups for individuals. So trying to make that link between food aid, other food projects, and the advice and support that people might need, say, particularly to address some of the root causes that may be causing them to struggle, such as low income or problems with their benefits. Then finally, from me, I just wanted to tell you briefly about our London Food Poverty Profile here at Sustain, which is a project we run separately to Food Power, funded by Trust for London, that assesses what the London boroughs, London councils are doing on 10 key measures around food poverty. So really centering around what council's contribution can be. So this is an example of how we've assessed what London councils are doing around ensuring that children have access to food 365 days a year. So our survey asks about support for ensuring free school meals are taken up, provision of breakfast clubs, and also coordinating, ensuring children have access to holiday food provision, as well as in some cases piloting or supporting holiday provision as well. And the darker boroughs on our map, that indicates that councils are doing more, so they're taking significant action. The lighter version is taking moderate action, and then the lightest version taking limited action. The grey areas where we don't have any reported action or data wasn't provided by the councils. It's a survey that councils need to fill in themselves to give us this information. And I think what we're trying to do at Sustain with this work in London is both identify what is happening across the capital, but also prompt councils to take stock of their own initiatives and find ways that they can perhaps improve their response to food poverty. And we have seen certainly interest in our maps and this new online version that we introduced this year, that does prompt decision makers to reflect on what they are providing locally and if there is more that they can do, even though we are obviously living in quite difficult times for the public sector in terms of finances. But some of our actions are very much about a coordinating role, a referring role, a leadership role, not just about putting funding or significant amounts of funding into initiatives. So I'll stop there and hand over to Wendy Eads, who is representing Feeding Britain today. I believe you've now turned on your microphone, Wendy, so I'm going to mute mine and hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Just to clarify, I'm not representing Feeding Britain. I'm actually a member of Feeding Coventry, which is an independent charity in Coventry in the West Midlands. And we're working towards making Coventry a food resilient city where no one goes hungry. So what I'm just going to talk about is a discrete project that we did around producing an infographic around 10 facts about food and poverty in Coventry. However, just to start a little bit of context as to why we did this and which audience it was aimed at, we actually produced our first Coventry Food Charter in November. We launched it in November 2017. And we, as a group, are actually a very diverse group. We're made up of local community organisers, academics, city council staff, business representatives of a range of food aid providers, and we're hoping to include people who've had experience of food poverty in the future. So we're quite a diverse group, and I wonder, Simon, if you can show the first slide, if that's okay. Thank you. Basically, our food charter has 5 priorities for ending food poverty and building resilience. And so we're looking at proclaiming and celebrating the universal right to food, and trying to sort of collect knowledge and map knowledge about, as Simon has been discussing, mentioned earlier, what is actually happening out in Coventry in terms of food poverty and the responses to it. Our second one is promoting a community food culture, which is looking at involving local people and local food providers and also community activities around food. The third one is enabling food producing environments and reducing food waste. So looking at community growing and also looking at trying to encourage as many people as possible and also organisations and businesses to reduce food waste. We're also looking at supporting an ethical business social enterprises around food so that we can become a sustainable food city. And really, I think where this infographic came from, campaign and work for food justice and trying to identify and tackle the root causes of food injustice and poverty. So we've got this food charter infographic already, but we really wanted to get people thinking about what that meant in terms of statistical data, something that was simple and thought-provoking. And so we actually decided to produce a one-page A4 handout that we could give out at the food charter launch, but also that we could use in different community settings later on. And we hope to update it on a regular basis. So if we can just show you the example of that on the next slide, please, Simon. Basically, we'd used an earlier version of this when we were trying to promote Feeding Coventry and try and get people interested in joining us at the Positive Images Festival, which runs annually in Coventry City Centre. And then Tina Wuchicks from Coventry City Council had put together a similar one-page flyer for that. And we noticed that it actually got people's attention, people asking us questions about that at that event. So I used that as a starting point. And we are aiming it at a wide audience to promote the food charter and also get people thinking about food and poverty in Coventry and what it actually means for people, and also relating it to the local context a bit. Also, we need something that we could put online. Quite a lot of people are accessing information about Feeding Coventry online these days, and it's a way of getting that message across. In terms of deciding on what data we were going to use, we wanted to limit ourselves to 10 facts. And I suppose we also had a trade-off between what we wanted to tell people and get message across, and what data we actually could get that was up to date, accurate and local. I've tried to pick the information relating to the 5 priorities of the food charter, although couldn't actually do that all the time. Basically, most information is about the root causes of food poverty in Coventry. But it also aims to sort of get that people's attention. I'd say if you're thinking of doing this, think about what access you've got and try and keep it local, but obviously try and provide national comparisons where possible as well. And we used local data sources. In this case, we used the Trussell Trust Food Bank in Coventry, but we are hoping to extend that as we're doing a mapping exercise, which will hopefully cover a whole range of food aid providers in Coventry and a whole range of projects, and that process is happening now. I think also we were very fortunate in that we had access to a research team, insight team at Coventry City Council, who were able to produce some of the national data and local data quite quickly. But we've chosen to focus in on things that got people's attention, which they might be interested in. So looking at Coventry Food Bank and the actual number of food parcels it was giving out, we had up-to-date information on that. But also focusing in on some of the sort of headline of that, the fact that low income was an issue in Coventry. And that was going to perhaps become more significant when we get into the rollout of the universal credit benefit, which is happening later this year. But we also wanted to show people that there was deprivation in Coventry, and so we used some national statistics from the Index of Multiple Deprivation to show that Coventry was actually had a lot of examples of that across compared to England as a whole. We also looked at the number of households in poverty, and nearly a third of households will actually, according to the Child Poverty Action Group, actually said that they were in poverty, and they had a measure to try and sort of assess that. We also wanted to focus on children, because I think that's something that, again, people are concerned about in Coventry and throughout the country. And so we're looking at children in low-income families as well. We haven't put a lot of information about those data sources deliberately. We've put some links at the bottom, and we've put contact details if people want to follow that up. But we really just wanted people to be able to see the basic information and to keep it simple. And so we're thinking about our audience. What would they want to know about? We looked at, I think we wanted to also look at free school meals as an indicator of food poverty and its impact on children, because that's part of some of the activities that we've been involved in Feeding Coventry. But we also wanted to look at reducing waste in the city and some of the sort of issues around that. The information we got wasn't as accurate as we would like. There's better information on the waste reduction RAP data, but that was quite complex to get across in a short, tiny bit of infographic. So we chose not to go that way on this occasion. We were actually doing this quite quickly, within 2 weeks, to try and get the whole project complete. So there's things we might want to do differently in future. And as a PhD student who'd worked in children's centres, I had sort of foot in both camps. I knew about the accuracy of data, but I also wanted it to be something that was meaningful to the people who'd be reading it. We also wanted to include some positive information as well. So we put the information about the fact that Coventry has over 3,000 allotments as a positive response, and that community growing is something that we want to develop and increase in the future. We also wanted to look at things that people could do to help, because one of the responses we got from Positive Images was, what can we do? How can we get involved? And so if we can go to the next slide, we also put on the back of the 10 facts 5 things you can do to help. I want to obviously sign people up to the Coventry Food Charter, not just organisations, but also individuals. But we want people to think about their own personal responses in terms of food waste, in terms of donating to food banks and other food aid providers, and also growing their own fruit and vegetables and buying from local and community owned food producers. It's something that we want to build on, I think, but it is something that it's important. Facts, there's a lot of facts out there that are interesting, but we want people to take ownership of all this sort of things that they can do and contribute themselves, because that's what we're about. In Feeding Coventry and Coventry Food Charter is about taking responsibility about how we change things in the future. In terms of looking at designing the document, we did stick to our 10 facts, and there were a few more that we would have liked to have included. We kept it simple because people don't read an awful lot, and we used infographics and colour. We were very fortunate in Coventry City Councils have a department who could help us with that. And also that looked very good online as well. But we did provide hard copies because not everybody accesses this information online, and it's good to sort of promote and get people interested in what Feeding Coventry is trying to do. But it's important to put contact information and website details on there as well, so that people can follow that up. We were sort of in terms of planning to update it annually. This was very much seen as a discrete project. It's one of these things you think, oh, this is a good idea, and then it sort of takes off from there. We are hoping that we can now perhaps move on from that, and we're very much aware that it's not perfect. There's lots of things that we want to do that we perhaps couldn't include on that. Simon mentioned about the lack of availability of monitoring on a national basis, on a government basis. That can hinder sometimes what we want to find out about, what we want to tell people about in the local area. We're part of Feeding Britain, and as such, we've moved on as an organisation. So we have taken on looking at the 4 aims in Feeding Coventry, which is building food security, protecting people from hunger, low-cost food for vulnerable groups, and supporting people in crisis. And so I think future editions of this 10 facts may well represent that a bit more specifically, and we can use that as a basis to involve people more directly. In terms of our response from our audience, broadly very positive. I think we probably need to map that as well and take on board what people want to hear about and want to find out about. And certainly there are a lot of people interested in this topic. We need to find different ways of disseminating that and trying to... I think we find that people want to get involved, and we want to reflect that and give them opportunities to do that. But we also need to get more information and try and sort of close some of those gaps. And I think food insecurity is something that needs to be developed. I'm hoping that will be taken on as a national project, but it may take a while to get there. So in the meantime, as a local charity trying to bring organisations in our local area together, that's something that we maybe need to grasp the nettle of, and we need to find different ways of getting that information locally and making that more meaningful. I think that's probably all I'm going to say, but be happy to hear other people's ideas and to see other examples of mapping and presenting information in a clear way in local context. So I'll hand back over to you, Simon. Okay.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That's really interesting and great to hear both particularly around the process and the reaction you've had locally. Apologies, I misintroduced you. I obviously came up to Coventry at the end of last year, so I don't know how I managed to get that wrong. And thank you to Sabine for clarifying that the EFAN Independent Food Aid map is of food banks, independent food banks only, not other emergency food aid providers. I'll now hand over to Chris Bagley from Greater Manchester Poverty Action to talk about their food providers map.
Hi, Simon, can you give me the access to the slides so I can move them forward myself rather than having to ask you to do it for me? Good morning, everybody. I'm from Greater Manchester Poverty Action.
Chris, you should be able to do that yourself if you hover over the slides. But
right. Okay, thank you.
Just tell me and I'll do it for you.
Oh, there it goes. Thank you, everybody, for waiting. So Greater Manchester Poverty Action is an organisation that across the whole of the city region looking at opportunities and ideas and support to strengthen collaboration between the organisations that are trying to reduce poverty in the city area. We drew on the network that we have in Greater Manchester and brought together a group of people who were especially interested in food poverty and food insecurity. We were keen to find out what actions could make a difference and what we could do together that we couldn't do separately. One of the first steps we took was to look at how people access emergency food. We couldn't find a single source that showed where people could go in Greater Manchester. It was very fragmented, and apart from the Trussell Trust, could be quite hard to find. And so the map. We also decided we'd create a cartoon-style video of how a person accesses emergency food with different language voiceovers for people who either didn't have very good English, or it was a second language, or their literacy wasn't so good. That video is still in production. The map. We wanted also to know where the gaps were, and where the gaps were, whether they were related to areas where there wasn't as much food insecurity, or whether it was just almost accidental. We wanted to find out how much support there was. The assumption was that the majority of food banks would be run by the Trussell Trust, when in fact, out of the 167 that are now mapped, only 51 are Trussell Trust food banks. Nobody was prepared for how many there were. Some seemed ridiculously close together, but more often than not, they had different opening times. So they were all valid. We considered a self-service version where the providers could enter their own details and be responsible for keeping them up to date. But we looked at a website where that was on offer, and they have very few listed. Plus the technology to set that up and make it user-friendly, easily accessible and visually appealing became bigger than the job itself, so we shelved it. Over a period of a month, I gathered information on a simple spreadsheet that you can see before you now. Having decided on what data we were going to try to share for each food bank, and there are still some gaps which we continually try to fill on opening hours, on what the criteria are for accessing the food banks. Some are very straightforward, some are less clear. Once we got to, there we are. Once we got to a stage where I wasn't actually finding any new food banks, we went public, and that was January 2017. And we asked our audience to help us to improve it. We launched with 155 pins on the map. We now have 167. Quite a few providers have shut down, and new ones have been added. We later added membership pantries, where people pay just a couple of pounds for a full basket of food. Most of those locally are run by housing associations. And we also added community grocers and some pay-as-you-feel eat-in venues. We're hoping to add in now community growing and allotment style projects. And the eventual aim of this is to take the word emergency out of the map and have it as a food provider's map. At the side of the map is a brief introduction and a contact email address so that anyone visiting the map can get in touch with me. if I get an email with a proposed change, I check the details before amending the map and the database. I can't stress how critical it is that you keep the database up to date, the source of the map. When a food bank closes, I take it off the map and take it off the main section of the spreadsheet, but I do keep the data. And now that the map is a year old, it needs to be checked. That's relatively easy for the Trussell Trust, but it's taking longer, obviously, for all the others. The last thing we wanted was for someone to find a food bank on the map, spare, and get there to find out that it was closed. From the feedback we've received, we know that the map is used by a wide range of advisors and food bank customers, and it's been visited over 10,000 times. The feedback has been completely positive, and as a result, we've just launched our third map. Some advisors have completely failed to understand the map and have actually given a printout of it to their clients. In some cases, fortunately, they've also given them my phone number, so we've been able to sort that out. The map has greatly increased our knowledge of the kind of providers that deliver food aid across the city region, and the unexpectedly high number of food banks and other outlets has been something of a call to action in itself for those who are concerned about the high levels of food poverty. We're now bringing together many of the providers in food insecurity in a project to look at ways of reducing dependency on emergency food and improving the city region's resilience. If you're considering setting up a map like this, obviously start with the Trussell Trust. Then local authority websites. They're not all good, but some are surprisingly informative. The Salvation Army are quite good, but not across the board, and you have to look at each individual unit because they don't have a central database or a central website. Talk to advice givers, people like Citizens Advice, local law centres, health centres. Most of them will be referring people to food banks, so it's worth finding out which ones they use. The rest, I'm afraid, is just graft. You just have to look at the website, make absolutely sure you keep an up-to-date database so that you can relaunch it if you have to. It's worth getting contact details for all the food banks, letting them know that there is a map and asking them to check their own details. But I would suggest not putting every detail on the map. Encourage users to look at the food banks or the provider's website or call them so that they get the most up-to-date information. That can mean leaving some off if they don't have a website or phone number, and we have had to leave a few off that didn't have a single publishable address. We found quite a few food banks that operated out of somebody's home. You can, of course, use different pins to show different types of food banks or different types of provision. This is a Google map. Play around, see what works for you. The biggest snag is that when two providers share the same postcode and they sit on top of another on the map, you can't access both from the map, but you can access each individual one from the lists on the left-hand side of the map, and you can untick any of the lists to make them clearer. If there are two food banks that overlap, you can actually just expand the scale of the map, and normally then you can pick out an individual one. Sorry, this is all very practical stuff. I hope it's of interest. Overall, sharing this map has been a very positive experience. We know it's proved to be a valuable tool, so much so that we've just launched our third map. The second was showing where people could go to get reconditioned, refurbished, inexpensive household items such as furniture, white goods, and small electrical items. And the most recent one was for advice, information, and guidance, both accredited and informal. We're very fortunate in Greater Manchester that we have a very active group of organisations tackling food poverty and food waste, including organisations that you may not have heard of, such as Cracking Good Food, and one you most likely have heard of, which is Fair Share. Fair Share Greater Manchester is a really formidable group of people. I'm done. Thank you, Simon. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. I think that's exactly what I was hoping, is that you would run through the sort of practicalities of how you brought together your map. And frankly, it's a big scale that you're working on in terms of the geography. So I think that's incredibly impressive to have got to where you've got to, and great that it is being used as well. The questions that we have had so far relate to Emily in Brighton asking about local housing allowance, so the benefit that's paid for people with a private landlord that's set by government, and the issue is that it doesn't cover the cost of the real cost of rents in an area, in many areas. So Emily was asking if others had any evidence of how work that's been done to compare the LHA government rate against the actual real rents in areas, and comparing different areas around the country. So I flagged up that London councils have done some work on this in the past. I don't know if others can put anything else into the attendee chat that they are aware of. Then Kathy did ask about the issue of some food banks not wanting to put themselves onto maps for a worry that people will turn up without the proper referral being made. Emily from Brighton's responded already to say that that wasn't their initial experience in Brighton, but actually working with food banks and the map that they had, that sort of barrier has reduced. And Rebecca asked,
Simon, Simon, can I just come in there on that comment about referrals people have? That was one of the things we really wanted to have on the map, that, you know, what the referral needed to be, because in some cases it's a straightforward food bank voucher, and in other cases it was evidence of benefits, and in some cases it was just how good is your story, as far as the people were concerned. What we did do was to leave any food bank on the map that didn't have any capacity to take any more people, the map to show clearly where the food banks were. But we were happy to say, you know, this food bank is at capacity, please don't visit it. But we wanted the pin on the map because it's the visual thing as well as the usefulness.
Thank you very much, Chris. And also Rebecca was asking just about the sort of tech behind your map. I believe it's a Google map. Can you say just briefly a little bit more about the tech aspect?
I'm not technical, so it couldn't be it couldn't be a technical map. It's Google Maps. You can just literally, I was going to say Google it, but you can. All it is you set up you say that you want to set up a map. You import a database. In my case, it was an Excel spreadsheet. And you decide which thing. Obviously, the pin goes where in my case, the pin goes where the postcode is. And if you have a look at the map at any time, you'll find that when you click on a pin, you get the name of the food bank and the details of where it is, when it's open, what the contact details are. But that was just building the spreadsheet so that those columns were all there before I started. It's not complicated. It couldn't be, otherwise I couldn't do it. The advice and information map has multicolored pins on it. That was the first time we'd branched out in that area. Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think it's something that perhaps we can provide a bit of a summary of what Chris said in terms of the tech aspect. I'll check it with someone else who knows what they're doing within our briefing as well, because I know it can appear a bit overwhelming when you first see these maps, but as Chris said, it's getting the data, I think, into the Excel spreadsheet in the right format, and then knowing how to upload it and exactly how it will appear on the map. So the preparation rather than the end product. So we'll include that in our briefing information. So thanks for asking that, Rebecca. And I just wanted to flag that in the slides we've got some links to some of the key things we've spoken about today. I haven't included everything. The links will all be in the Food Power briefing, which will be published in March. So for now, those are some links, but everything should be fairly Googleable. should be easy to find via the web that I've mentioned today, and we'll put these slides up later today. Was there anything else people wanted to ask, or comments on the kind of things that you might like to still see covered in our briefing or through the Food Power Project in other ways, through our webinars or conferences on this issue? Are there any comments that you'd like to make or suggestions around our work in this area? I sort of don't want to leave too much silence, so I think what we'll probably do is we'll stop speaking as such, but we'll keep the attendee chat open for a few minutes. Oh. So Francis is asking about attempts to try to measure household food insecurity or proxies. So I think that is some of that I tried to cover in my bit of the webinar around the welfare data, income data, free school meal uptake, healthy start data. Also, Wendy talked about the kind of proxy data and other more immediate data that they can use. There are some areas where they have surveyed individuals and households around their household food insecurity using some of those survey questions from the USDA or the IFES. I think the briefing document will allude to some of those and refer specifically to the pages where the results of that surveying and in some cases the questionnaire themselves can be found. So hopefully that again saves people some work in terms of not having to reinvent the wheel on that one.
Just to let you know, sorry, Simon, this is Wendy. Just to let you know that also it very much depends upon the sample that your local authority is using. Certainly, we devised a question for the biannual household survey, in the council, and but when I looked at the results, there wasn't a lot of detail there. I think possibly because the sample maybe didn't include people who had experienced food insecurity. So just bear that in mind. I think it's something that we'll need to do more work on in the future.
Thank you, Wendy. In terms of the sort of range of proxy indicators that you might be able to use, Rachel Hodge is asking about. Our Sustained Food Poverty Action Plan has a list of them, and the measurement briefing will show you where other suggested lists are available. Thanks, Andy Jolly, for flagging up the FSA Food and Use survey, which did include, in the last wave, some questions around household food insecurity and provided some very shocking figures around levels of household food insecurity in the UK. Chris, there's a question for you. Do you know how many of the over 100 non-Trussell Trust food banks on your map are independent food banks? I know you've included some food banks and food pantries, but I also noticed at least one venue that collects food but doesn't give it out. Are you able to respond to that?
There are about 12 pantries and a few grocers, but I would think out of the 167, take out the Trussell Trust, I would say at least 85 of them are still independent food banks. But some of them are very informal and literally can only give out what they get in through a local church or a local community centre.
Thank you, Chris. So at this point, I think I will stop recording the webinar, but as I said, leave the chat open so that people can swap any further information or exchange contact details if you'd like to. Thanks very much for all of those joining, including our international guests. And thanks, also a massive thanks to Wendy and Chris, who've given up their time to join us today. And I think the feedback that we're having coming through from the attendee chat shows how useful people have found both your presentations. So thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.